This is the phase 2 of the interview with Martin Locker of Perennial Pyrenees project, and we are now embarking on Numinous territory, as the last phase of this episode was about Pyrenees and the local traditions and all the things related to that. And we are now at the mystical side of things, I would say the night side of our mutual interest with Martin. I would like to start this second phase with the liminal. How would you define liminal? And I would personally add that, of course, Pyrenees is kind of a liminal space between Spain and France to give people some idea of what's liminal. But I'm speaking about the more metaphysical side of the liminal here. And I know that you are also well versed in this topic yourself. But what's your personal take?
Well, it's as you said, like on the more geographical or prosaic level, the liminal space is simply a space between two concrete kinds of state or terrain, a sort of transitional arena. But I think in a more metaphysical way, you can sort of describe a liminal space. Well, similarly, as it's a space which is at one time maybe transitional in a sense, or it can also be a space which exists not necessarily outside, but I would say parallel to the normative spaces that one encounters on a daily basis. This is, this is affected by various different aspects, including those of the person approaching it. And that also ties in something I'm sure we're going to talk about later with the numinous element. So I won't go into that particularly now. But yeah, it's in a very simple way, because of course there's a huge body of literature on this. The liminal space in a kind of metaphysical way is this parallel area or a kind of hinterland in which the kind of normal experiences of being are blended with the kind of other.
I think that's a good definition. I would add that in modern internet cultures, there is this kind of a meme of liminal spaces, like pictures of empty movie theaters at night or school rooms, and like parking lots or whatever. It's like they kind of seem to evoke some kind of nostalgic and also like a bit eerie. I think it has something to do with this phenomenon called uncanny valley. Maybe it's kind of a like milder expression of the numinous mysterium tremendum et fascinans, like the terrible and the fascinating mystery of the numinous. But we can go that later. It's such a broad topic, but nevertheless.
Well, actually, those liminal spaces on the which are now popularized on the internet are very interesting because they have those elements in them which are a mixture, as you said, like nostalgia, because a lot of them are places which have a resonance with similar places from our childhood, but they also have this aspect of them in which they should be peopled, but their emptiness, their emptiness, which is the kind of antithesis of their function, gives that slightly eerie and in some strange way comforting feeling. It's a very kind of oxymoronic combination.
Yeah, it's paradoxical in a sense.
Yeah, and I wonder if that's something as well with the liminal aspects of the idea of liminal spaces. They are, or liminal experiences. They're not concretely one thing or the other, and they often exist in that, as you said, like a paradoxical mixture of it being a very powerful experience, both in a it's impossible to pin down because of the liminal space.
Yes, it's the nature of liminal.
It's that fluid, sort of slightly parallel to normal experience aspect to them, in which there's this blending of something other in that arena, which you cannot really concretely identify, but which is strong enough to unsettle you without necessarily being what one would describe as like classically frightening or something like that.
I would even go far as to say that if you don't understand liminal, you don't understand the occult, so to speak. It's so like in the DNA of the occult.
I suppose it's that otherness within a liminal experience or a liminal state or a liminal location, which gives a certain flavor or feeling, which is, gosh, how would you say it? It's so close. I personally think it's so closely tied to the numinous, because it has that element of almost existing outside of normal temporal flow, if you know what I mean. There is this experience of a, not necessarily like time stopping or something, but you being for that moment slightly outside of normal time.
Maybe your own like persona. For example, I think there's this term called ecstasis, which would mean like out of the body or out of your presence or something like that. I think in the hectic modern world where we are constantly bombarded by information and entertainment and distraction, I think people yearn for some kind of liminal experiences. And in the most trite or most like a pleb sense of the pleb experience would be some kind of like a weekend partying when somebody is over their head drunk. There may be some kind of festival sips, that kind of thing. Las Vegas, an epitome of
Yeah,
consumerist
slightly
liminalism. Yeah.
dystopian liminalism.
And what happens in
No,
Las Vegas stays in Las Vegas, for example.
well,
That's
exactly.
liminal,
It's locked in. But that liminal element is, I guess you say, it's like the best way to kind of approach it, I think, is in a kind of topographical metaphor, because if you have two concrete geographical locations and then this area in between, which is relatively undefined in a way, or it's it's kind of the place where things trickle into the cracks and become in a way forgotten about, and it's those sort of like, I guess you say, almost forgotten or ignored or under-experienced locations, which give you that sense, because there is the element of the unknown. There's the element of not being somewhere which is popularly known and appreciated. There's that. Often, if you have something like a stream flowing between two fields, for example, that could be a liminal space, because it's very much a physical boundary, but also something which is not static and has a flow to it, which has a kind of strange time frame. You think about water and the idea of a concrete space and an undefined space, and the undefined space is what constitutes that as being a particular place, because the water obviously is never in the same location. It's there and it's gone, but
Yes.
somehow that particular place is a place. So it's quite a confusing and nebulous concept. But I think if you approach it from a topographical kind of way to begin with, it's probably the most useful way of beginning to kind of appreciate liminality. It's between two states, effectively, is what it is.
I think this is very, very interesting in the sense that the Netherworld Gate Tuonenportti is also like a research group. We are constantly researching certain subjects such as the liminal, genius loci, daimon, egregore, and the numinous especially. I have had this personal obsession to understand what is the correlation of genius loci, the spirit of the place, the liminal, the phenomenon of egregore, and the numinous. What you just said really brings this closer to home. That, like you just said, liminal and the numinous share a relation, and I think you were just approaching the genius loci territory with your last sentence.
Yeah, I mean, it's genius loci is a curious phenomena, because it depends really how you approach it in terms of what it means to you. Broadly speaking, of course, it has this element of being a spirit of place.
Yes.
But that in itself is a highly nebulous concept, because are we talking about a spirit of place which is an extant manifestation of a certain geographical location, some kind of supernatural manifestation, or are we talking about our own reflecting of our own aesthetics and experiences and ideas onto a place which we find particularly compelling for whatever reason, usually linked back to those things I just said? Or is it some kind of strange interplay between the two? It's a very shifting phenomenon. But I think that if you have, I mean, to put it in the most simplistic, if you go into a location which for you has some, I'm not talking about necessarily a memorial location, but some kind of location which for you strikes you as particularly affecting and you're not entirely sure why, and you have a sensation of otherness in that location, that for me is a sort of genius loci experience. There is this great tendency to think of this very concrete manifestation of some kind of being which is, representing that particular place in a very kind of classical Greco-Roman tradition. That for a lot of times I think it's very, very wishful thinking, or one could say simply almost like a puerile way of looking at it, because you're looking for some kind of physical, usually anthropomorphized mechanism of the place expressing itself. But that sensation of something, that sensation of that place being alive in a supra-biological sense is approaching the idea of the genius loci, I think.
Like you said, it's pretty subjective. Not everybody will have the same experience or any kind of experience at all at the place where there supposedly is genius loci. But I
No,
think
and that's what's
yeah,
that's
yeah,
what's fascinating though, because if you think about what I find particularly interesting is why certain people have certain very kind of instinctual reactions to certain landscapes, especially when those landscapes are nothing to do with what they've been really brought up around or even particularly exposed to. So there's something in them which is attracted to that particular kind of landscape, be it aesthetically or whatever, but it's outside of their real experience. And if you think about the genius loci aspect, I mean, some people don't resonate with certain places, yet they do with others. Now, is this to do with the fact that they have an aesthetic appeal, or they have some kind of inner, whatever it may be, attraction towards those places, or that they recognize, and that attraction opens up a recognition between them and the place, and they feel whatever may be there, and other places completely not. And it doesn't, I mean, when you talk about genius loci, and the same with liminal things, I mean, it doesn't have to be bombastic as a location. It could be a little, a little curvature of a stream somewhere fairly innocuous.
yeah,
But
like
that
subtle.
has some, yeah, exactly, that's subtle. That has some particular resonance for whatever reason that is.
Before we approach the monster in the closet, the most important topic of all, the Numinous, I think there's something behind bridge from the genius loci to the concept of daimon, which is of course quite manifold and it's not easily explained. But I would very much like to hear your personal take on the first at the historical, mythological concept of the daimon and
The kind of, I suppose, like if you want to look at the kind of mythological framework of the daemon,
yeah,
it's essentially a kind of inspirational muse-like entity, I guess, which can dwell within you, and also could, I forget which philosopher was talking, was it Plato who was talking about listening to his daemon? Was it Plato? I can't remember. Or Socrates? I can't remember. One of the
maybe
two. Maybe
both.
Socrates.
Yeah,
I think it's
yeah.
Socrates, because
I
then he
think it's
decided to
that one.
go.
Yeah,
He went hell for leather with his stuff and ended up dying. But yeah, it's if you think of it as an inner voice, but which is not your own, effectively. That's at a very, very, very basic level. That's kind of what it is. It's an inner voice which is not your own, and which can give you inspiration, or it can give you guidance or other things, but it's not it's not like something which is gifted to you. It comes and it can go at its own discretion, basically.
For the sake of our listeners, I might read directly from Merriam-Webster's dictionary. And the etymology is quite interesting because people tend to mix daimon with demon. Let me just read the paragraph from the dictionary. In Middle English, evil spirit borrowed from late Latin daimon, pagan deity, idol, going back to Latin, supernatural being, spirit, intermediate between humans and gods, borrowed from Greek daimon, superhuman power, variably evil or beneficent, intervening in human affairs, fate, there's mentioned Homeric, personal
Yeah.
spirit, bringing luck or ill, accompanies an individual, spirit intermediate between humans and gods. I think people get an idea what we are talking about.
Yeah, it's this. I suppose you could say it also has this bridging aspect between the kind of divine realm of creation and inspiration.
Numinous.
Yeah, to a
In a
degree,
sense.
and the human. The negative aspects could be potentially that it could drive one to madness, or it could be fulfilling something, some path which is not necessarily what you want, but you feel driven and impulsed to do so. That area of things, I would say.
There is also this term called daimonic, not demonic, but daimonic. And I think it's something along the lines what you just said, that some kind of passion which can drive person a bit mad. And it's daimonic is much of a negative term than daimon, I think.
I don't think I think that's also because it's not necessarily looking out for you. It's looking out for its own goal, which might dovetail very nicely with you, but it might also, lead you into some pretty unpleasant territory.
I think we have just touched upon briefly about this daimon subject. We might go from egregore to the numinous. So, what would you define egregore?
So I guess one way of thinking about egregore is almost like a zeitgeist. It's a collective spirit which coalesces together around one kind of motivation, one essential concept, I think that's one way of kind of describing it, which is reasonably basic, really. There's lots of different interpretations in terms of the manipulation, the use, the conjuring, blah 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 blah.
Yeah, of course.
But it's that kind of. I think that it's sort of similar to what we now talk of as a kind of a zeitgeist, which can really become whipped up into a sort of maniacal, ultra-focused kind of frenzy under one particular tenant. So it has that huge drive. It has that capacity for a huge focus and drive, despite the fact that it's welling up in lots of different people at the same time.
The mass psychosis would be kind of clinical term for egregore. And then there's, of course, there's this modern magical type of egregore concept. And then there is, of course, the original from the ancient Greek. I think it was egregoros, wakeful, is an occult concept representing a non-physical entity that arises from the collective thoughts of a distinct group of people. Historically, the concept referred to angelic beings or watchers and the specific rituals and practices associated with them, namely within Enochian traditions. This is straight from the Wikipedia, but to give you some idea, give the audience some idea that this is also a concept and term which has many like different meanings. And to add some like a comedic levity here, I would say that with a straight face, I might add that Coca-Cola, Jesus Christ, money, and whatever, like the Roman Empire was and is like a kind of an egregore, like you said, zeitgeist, like a group
it can
spirit.
be a zeitgeist, it can be a hysteria, it can be an agreed upon concept. I mean, if you think about structured, organized religious movements, I mean, they have to agree upon a certain identity and attributes of a certain being. And in a sense, that's an egregore because they've all fed and coalesced, but also firmly structured out. a particular conceptual being which is not necessarily organically flourished. It's been pushed and molded into a particular form. So that could also be described as an egregore as well.
These concepts are manifold, like I just said with the previous ones we touched upon, and I don't think we need to go further with egregore, just to give our audience some idea that they can see how these things might have some kind of interconnectedness, even though these are like distinct phenomena at their own. If one would think we were raiders of the lost ark, and what I think the ark should be the Numinous. The term was made known by Rudolf Otto, the German theologian in 1920s. He had this book, Das Heilige, the idea of the holy. And I think you can probably read it free if you just look it up from the internet. This is according to Merriam-Webster, of course. The first entry is supernatural and mysterious. That I think is the most common and not that even esoteric understanding of the term. Other is filled with the sense of the presence of divinity, holy. Third, appealing to the higher emotions or to the aesthetic sense, like spiritual. And Numinous is from the Latin word numen, meaning nod of the head or divine will, the latter sense suggesting a figurative nod of assent or of command of the divine head. English speakers have been using numen for centuries with the meaning a spiritual force or influence. The meaning of the adjective includes supernatural or mysterious, as in possessed of numinous energy, force, holy, the numinous atmosphere of the catacombs, and appealing to the aesthetic sense, the numinous nuances of her art. This is the dictionary example. This topic and this phenomenon goes much, much further. Of course, I would like to hear your personal take on this.
I suppose the Numinous can be briefly described as being in the presence of that which transcends human nature. It's neither good nor bad or evil. It's beyond the realms of human normal experience, certainly beyond a lot of human perspective as well. It is by its very nature undefinable, because it exists outside of the paradigms of our normal, of essentially our special methods of communication. It's rather like some of the more complex metaphors people use to describe God. You know, if you look at some of the Christian mysticism, which uses these kind of highly contradictory statements. It is neither, he is neither, but he is neither. Blah, blah, blah. It operates outside of the kind of binaries of human thought, and I think it's useful to kind of conceptualize it as awe. It's awesome, as in it will fill you with awe, but that awe is by no means untinged with fear or horror, in the same way that something can be so beautiful that it's terrifying. It is the numinous experience is outside of humanity. It's outside of time. It exists beyond our sphere of 99% living, in a way.
Yeah, it defies categorization completely.
It does, because it is so beyond.
Somebody used the term wholly other, completely other. In modern Western world, for example, tends to be very dichotomic and dualistic, in the sense that everything needs to be packaged and everybody needs to be contained. I have asked you to define this next parable at least third times, and this is the final time, and it will go to this record. And so you have practiced this.
I know what you want.
Yes,
I know what you want. The extraterrestrial synonym.
Just go on.
But to put it extremely bluntly, I mean, if no matter whether you are the world's biggest UFO truther or a complete skeptic, in either case, at whatever end of the spectrum of belief you reside, if you had a physical encounter with an alien, an extraterrestrial from another planet or galaxy or universe or whatever it may be, it would be almost impossible to fit that within your extant worldview, because it would shatter it. Because all of our preconceptions, all of our experiences, our lives run along these tracks, which are effectively designed within the cage of the Earth, and the idea that theoretically there might be something out there, but I mean, on a practical level, who cares? It's whatever. But the horizon expansion of encountering an extraterrestrial face to face would be so monumental and so paradigm shifting, and so it'd be such an earthquake, not just, of course, like in terms of socio-political, but within you, that it would be not impossible, but it would be incredibly difficult to put your kind of frames of reference back together to encompass this enormous new piece of information. It would be horrifying and bewildering and magnificent at the same time.
That's kind of like a scientific example. I think your example is good in the sense that everybody can now at least imagine if that kind of very remote chance would come true, and you would have to be the person to kind of interact with this kind of, let me say it, the holy other. That would be kind of a scientific, non-supernatural, the holy other.
It would rearrange, it would crumble, essentially, every kind of perspective you had on the world. And I think that's getting close towards the kind of Numinous experience in a really profound sense has, because it is such a wedge driven into your soul and opened into the limitless, fathomless other, that it's not something which can at all be seen as a comfortable, even I would say even a desirable experience, because it's so radically altering. I think you have a lot of people who are embarking on what they would term as spiritual paths, who will themselves into experiencing something, but what they experience is a self-curated revelation, shall we say, because it fits with the framework which they desire. If you read some of the mysticism of, I tend to use Christian mysticism as an example, because it's what I know a little bit more about from my sort of archaeological, which is my archaeological background is mainly in kind of medieval ecclesiastical stuff. So that's more where I have some kind of knowledge. But the way in which they discuss the revelation of experiencing the divine in a really deep sense, there's always a strong undercurrent of horror, of fear, it's deeply, and they are left deeply unsettled by it. There may be a huge amount of bliss as well, of course, especially if you're talking about it from a Christian framework of this divine love. But the divine love is not something which is it's a scouring pad. It's not a cotton wool ball.
The concept of sacred horror, which is basically mysterium tremendum side of the Numinous, the actual real Numinous experiences has to be somewhat like searching for the right words here, but it must be something which will kind of put you on your knees, so to speak. It
must be profoundly humbling. I know that you and I have talked about this before and expressed our own similarly strong opinions. A lot of the presented information and experiences on in this area of things, and what astounds both of us, I think, is the absolute lack of humility when it comes to some of these things. It's very egocentric in this
Yes.
search and drive to be connected with whatever divine aspect that this person is looking for. It's very much a reflection on them. It's very much a self-derived bargain-seeking arrangement, rather than a opening oneself up to whatever it might be. It's this kind of mercantile approach of, I want to get close because I want to experience, because I want this, want. It's not it's not I desire to know my place.
If there is some kind of experience which you have yourself induced to yourself, say something you are in control of, as opposed to
Exactly.
something which you don't have any kind of control of. I would say that most people tend to play at the field where they know the rules and they have the control. And I think with modern, at least in some kind of a culture side of the occult scene, there is too much control.
Well, I mean, it can be very nicely packaged and very nicely sold and very nicely written about and blah blah. I think there's an interesting parallel there between some of the, well, not some, but a lot of the people who are very fond of conspiracy stuff. They would far prefer that there is a secret cabal of world government controlling this, and this, rather than the more likely reality that it is a mixture of incompetence, chance, poor decisions, and there is a kind of strongly chaotic element which is rushing up to greet us. Because at least the first option, that there's, it might be a shit plan, but it's a plan. There's some rules to the game, and there's things in place and checks and balances, and I can work my way here and there and rather than the kind of, it's a complete fucking mess, and there's there's an abyss at the end of the tunnel. And
Yeah,
I think, but you know what I mean. Like in
Yes.
a lot of the kind of modern occulture aspects, there's things are neatly packaged and neatly pigeonholed and certain and labeled. This, do this, do this, do this. Get here, get there, do this, get this, blah 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 blah. Whereas the idea of the numinous is no, man. It's if you experience it, it's going to storm through and break everything, and it's going to wash over you. And there's nothing you can do
Yes.
to stop it. And there's nothing you can do to ameliorate whatever you experience. It is a complete subjugation, a complete humbling to something which is, to use the words far greater than you, is such an understatement that, I mean, it's totally beyond and totally overwhelming.
How would you give people an idea where they could encounter this kind of numinous? Of course, that's a tall order, but what are such practices, or
It's, oh God,
hard question.
it is. It is. I think probably don't be around a lot of people. Probably on your own is a good way to start. Another aspect, I think, and from that, I think two things are important: learning to listen inside and learning to listen outside. I mean, really listen. Really, I'm not talking about like, oh, what wonderful birds, or oh, I can hear my inner bitch coming out. No, I mean, shut up and listen. I mean, really listen and come and try to put yourself in a frame of mind where you're not actually looking for anything out of it.
Maybe some kind of like a meditation in some unusual place, for example, could be a good idea to tune out of the
Well,
everyday
yes. Well, I mean,
trance.
I think that there is a great fetishization and tendency to kind of have these exotic locations as being hyper conducive, and of course, some locations are much more conducive than others.
Yeah.
I mean, if you're in a shopping center, it's going to be rather difficult, but it doesn't. Don't fall into this sort of exotic trap of, I have to seek out the furthest peak on the highest range. Well, no. I mean, Everything and everybody has the capacity to listen. It doesn't have to be in a cave. It doesn't have to be on some far-flung mountain. Obviously, somewhere where you are capable of listening is going to have a much more optimal result, shall we say. Even places like churches. I know that
Yes.
being Christian is deeply unfashionable now, but somewhere in a building such as that will certainly bring you much closer, I think. Now, I'm not a Christian, but I have an appreciation for a lot of aspects within it. It's going to be a lot more. It's going to give you a lot truer capability of experiencing something really profound.
Of course, there is meditation at some kind of abandoned houses and the caves and whatever. But I agree that there is a problem that people tend to need some kind of exotic, vehicles in order to
I
achieve this
think,
kind of
I
states.
think, yeah, I think that also ties into a lot of the issues we've privately touched upon, which in terms of the kind of the modern, or at least I don't want to keep saying modern because everyone's like, but like the social media phenomena of almost like if I meditate here, it looks like the real deal, and it's kind of like almost like good photo op. You know what I
It's
mean?
trendy.
It's like,
Yeah, it's trendy.
well, it's not just not even just trendy, but like, this place is like, this looks fantastic. This is going to be like such a wild experience, me being here. And it's like, yeah, but it's who's it? Okay, this is what it comes down to. I really think, in the kind of, if you want to boil it down to something, who is it for?
Good question.
I don't want to seem too kind of ridiculous, but I mean, all of these practices which have emerged often over centuries of by people who are incredibly attuned and wise. I mean, they all have a purpose and a function, and they all can be used to enable you to enter into an appropriate headspace. I'm not one of those kind of nihilistic, you just need yourself. I mean, they exist for a reason because a lot of them work. But there's a difference between, I think, there's a difference between fetishizing the process as opposed to treasuring the result.
Yeah.
And I think there's a great. We all know, this kind of social media stuff is hyper focused on image, and I think you see a lot of that online in the kind of pseudo spiritual networks of a very. It's almost like an art project in the way that it's portrayed, but it's done in order to show. It's not done for the person to experience.
Climb to a mountain and tell no one. That's a complete antithesis to nowadays Instagram,
Hmm.
attention whoring, one would say.
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
who's it for? Is it for you? Again, then we have the is it for you? Is it for you to demonstrate how how interesting and how wonderful your life is, or is it for you to try and learn something? And those lines are so often blurred.
I think there is
Mm.
some kind of problem that modern people in it, or hyper modern people, don't have any access to see that we are living in a planet floating in the endless space. That would give perspective. We are so entranced in our little troubles
Well,
all the
that's
time. Yeah.
that's one of those things to go back to the very 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 beginning of our chat. Like if you live with a good convenient access to nature, it's a very healthy perspective giver. If you have if your mind is running and there's a problem or
Yeah.
something, by going outside and being away and being among things which are a lot more permanent than you in many cases, or larger, it's a very good way of putting yourself into your own perspective. and seeing that actually it's not terribly important what I was worried about. And that's something which, is, I think that it's interesting if you look at some of the movements and some of the personalities, should we call them, of the modern esoteric scene, is that there's a very big emphasis on not doing that. Actually, it's much more about putting yourself into positions of power, putting yourself into positions of gain, rather than putting yourself into a position of perspective.
There's the easy way, and then there's a harder way of doing things, of course. And yeah, I think it's completely human in a sense, like it
Oh
probably
yeah.
ingrained out in DNA, this kind of opportunistic way of doing things.
Well,
Whatever.
and
Yeah.
no one wants to feel like shit. I mean,
Yeah.
it's just, in the same way. I mean, if you want to be, it's just, it's just, it's just very useful to have a healthy sense of perspective. I think
It's
on
like,
yourself and things and what's important and what's not. Of course, there's things that are important. They change from person to person and within a person's lifetime within themselves. But there's, I think, at a time when our focus is ever more turned inward, not in like in a spiritual sense, but in a self-obsessed sense. I would say that there's a greater need in a lot of these esoteric circles, or whatever, to push back against that and focus more on the other in a humble sense, in approaching the newness, rather than trying to harness it.
try to
But there's no
control.
money in
Yeah.
that, so
Yeah.
I mean, yeah, you
Yeah.
can't sell that very easily. So
Non-dualism, this is a logical next step in our discussion. I think it's also like a Buddhist concept. Like I said, the modern Western world seems to be heavily dualistic and dichotomic, with its almost childish obsession like war and peace, or love and hate, and good and evil, especially the latter.
well, it's very symptomatic. I'm not going to go into the kind of binary aspects of certain religious movements or whatever, because honestly, that's not something I know a huge amount about. But what's very, very obvious is that the surfeit of alleged information and access and sort of egalitarian access towards all sorts of subjects is that for some reason, the word which is an anathema to most public debates, should we say, is nuance. There is no nuance. It has to be one thing or the other. Now, whether that's because a general ability to think critically has declined and therefore the hyper-binary approach has come in, or whether the hyper-binary approach has undermined critical thinking to such a degree that it's fallen off anyway, I don't know. But the ability to have a nuanced way of thinking about things and to see that there's usually in almost every not every circumstance. Obviously, I think we can all identify one circumstance where there's no there's no gray area, but in a lot of them, there's a huge amount of contextual, wrangling and nuance to be had within any subject. So, but that is not something which is easily compressed into a 15-second soundbite. That's not something which is easily sold. That's
Yes.
something which involves effort on the part of the listener. And as I think we can all agree that the amount of effort people are willing to put into things now on behalf of themselves in terms of intellectually is certainly less than it could be.
What are your thoughts on tectonic and, for example, katabasis? This is a topic, of course, we have discussed many times before, and it was some theme Carl Jung was very interested on, and it's also a theme which has been in various world mythologies, the Greeks, for example, And I think it's also a common theme in the movies too, and all kinds of entertainment, at least in certain genres. For example, horror movies and thrillers, for example. You cannot escape tectonic.
No. I think that's probably a very accurate statement. I must preface anything I say by especially in this case, by mentioning that I do not have a massive understanding the chthonic and the katabasis and the anabasis aspects. Aside from a rather cursory impression from the various mythologies and some of the proven ritualized practices from some cultures. But my sort of cursory impression is that there may be something there which is it's quite representative of this idea of delving down into yourself, into those murky waters of subconscious thought and potentially as well memory. Memory is a strange thing which often becomes suppressed or partially kind of forgotten and languishes and resurfaces in some cases in dreams and other kind of unconscious physical states in a way. So I think that, but of course, there's also this idea of the realm of the dead, and the sort of the ancestral element in that. But I'm not sure whether I'm very wary because there's a lot of talk about ancestral stuff now. It's become very much more popular, and I think that one has to be very cautious how you approach that, not for any tedious political aspects, but because of there's a great tendency now to overemphasize the grandiose elements of getting in touch with one's ancestors and that kind of thing. But I think that there's certainly you could say that there's an element there of retreating back into, or not retreating back into, but delving down into the the kind of silent well springs that are present in a potential element of ancestral memory, of very kind of longue durée genetic tropes and genetic inheritances, as well as your own personal experiences, which all blend together but tend to languish very far from the kind of daily surface level memory collection. And that by retreating down there and also engaging with some unpleasant elements within your kind of lower, or shall we say, deeper and at times suppressed psyche, which can be a hell in itself sometimes. If you talk to any addict about that, I mean, they would probably say a similar thing. And then, of course, you retreat, you with the learning and the experience, the information, you take that information back into your surface level lifestyle, essentially your surface level psyche, and apply those lessons that you've learned, often in a none too enjoyable fashion, into your daily life. So I wonder if you were to look at it from a more kind of, I suppose, psychological point of view, that might be one interpretation I think that could hold water.
It reminds me of, for example, Jungian concept of shadow. And while you were speaking, I found excerpt from Carl Jung's The Red Book. It's from page 244, and it really is related to this theme. Take pains to waken the dead, dig deep mines, and throw in sacrificial gifts so that they reach the dead. Reflect in good heart upon evil. This is the way to ascend. But before the ascent, everything is night and hell. You might find this resonating.
Absolutely. I mean,
Yeah.
Young, obviously, of course, Young does have a wonderful way with words as well. His descriptions are always a pleasure to listen to, and I think that there's a lot of validity in that. I do. I find actually the concept in a related fashion as well. There's the concept of And one has to be careful how one treads around this because, of course, people make certain interpretations about your interpretations or discussions of these things which aren't necessarily accurate. But the idea of there being some deeper communal, for want of a better phrase, ancestral memory aspect, which it doesn't have to have a particularly mystical element. I mean, it could be kind of epigenetic
Yes.
in the way of humans existing for the majority of their lives in a well, the human species existing for the majority of its life within a more, shall we say, hunter-gatherer lifestyle, and the very that enormous period of time comparable to the relatively short settled time that we've been existing as a kind of settled species uh, rather than nomadic. But within that long time frame, you do of course have a gradual accretion of certain types of myth and cultural spiritual tropes, which are very analogous across several different cultures. And so I think that it's possible that if we're talking about a kind of underworld in a psyche way, that in those waters you have those kind of epigenetic currents of not just pure biology, but also cultural and religious cultural and spiritual cultural tropes from that enormous deep time frame that may well in some way be floating around as well, which can be drawn and which resurface in various fashions.
If you think about the different myths which has this theme of katabasis, the descent, and
Mm,
of course anabasis is the ascent. And I think it maybe was Jordan Peterson who said in the underground, in the catacombs or in the katabasis, the hero encounters the monster, the dragon. And
mm,
it's of course a dangerous and perilous journey, but also the dragon has gold. It has a treasure, but you have to fight for it. And after you conquer the dragon, or kind of maybe even integrate the monster in yourself, you embark on the anabasis, the ascent, and then you come back as an integrated, more whole person. And I think this is a maybe it's called monomyth, something
yeah,
which is like
I
a
think so. I think so.
prevalent in the world, different cultures. And I just read like a Wikipedia article on katabasis, and the list of the theme of katabasis like appearing on the different mythologies over the world was very long, a strong
Absolutely, absolutely. I
theme.
mean, Christ is such an enormous topic, but yes, this concept of there being a treasure which is encircled by some monstrous beast. One finds it in almost every culture, and almost inevitably it is within some subterranean location. Um, so yes, it is interesting to consider the idea of a descent away from the civilized and regular environment into a far more as well. The use of caverns and subterranean chambers as a trope is also interesting because, of course, and anyone who's been inside a cave will know that you are almost blind, and this idea of the underworld, obviously without wanting to sound trite, I mean, the lighting isn't going to be terribly good.
Yeah.
So there's this blindness element as well, in which you're kind of retreating, or not retreating, but you're delving down blind into very unfamiliar waters and unfamiliar territories in order to seize some aspect of information. Or in the myths, obviously, there's a lot of rescuing of loves, or of some divinely inspired object or treasure or something like that. But all of these things could be analogous to some manner of learning process and some wisdom that must be extracted from this far more irregular and dangerous environment, and then taken out and used in your life. And as Jung was talking about, integrated into yourself. And the experiences within those unpleasant arenas would also be integrated into your, into yourself afterwards, having risen back into the daily world. I think the problem, one of my hesitations with talking about this as well, is that often when you talk about this now, and this is a phenomenon which I think is really in the past 5 years, but with a lot of these discussions about getting not removing yourself, but going on the hero's quest away from civilization, is that it's very easy to sound like, how to put it, an internet tribal guru who draws on the wisdom of the ancients and that kind of thing. And there's a lot of people who do, and I think that a lot of them, the way they discuss it in terms of this hero motif, does a tremendous disservice to the rich complexity of, because it's not self-help, this kind of thing. You're really swimming with very complex and very archaic concepts and themes. The idea that one can simply just draw upon archetypes, man, this is a very rich and complex subject which people have dedicated their lives to kind of studying and trying to unpack. So I'm always slightly hesitant, with this kind of thing, because I never want to come across like I really know what I'm talking about, because it's a very, very complex thing. But I having said that, I do think that there's certainly a lot to this idea of the psychological aspect of extracting this element of potentially kind of suppressed experience or some manner of lesson to be learned and taken back and integrated into yourself. But the mechanisms by which one might do that, I think, are far better left to people who are explicitly trained in this area of things.
There is this fascination with true crime, like ex-gangsters writing biographies. They are like bestsellers in the Finnish market and, of course, over the world. And I think it's because people have been fed up with this white knight versus the true evil type of fiction. And there has been a search of gray characters. For example, Breaking Bad TV series, which is very famous. The main guy is like a drug kingpin. He's almost evil in many senses, but still people root for that guy. When I was watching that series, which is really a psychological journey, and with, I would say, even some Jungian themes. And I think it really tells about something of the state of our society, that people, this kind of trend is going on.
I
People
think
yearn
that
for
there's they do, but I think there's also something on a kind of parallel theme to that, which I think is very interesting, is not just in terms of crime, but, and obviously I'm okay. How should I phrase this without sounding depraved? Figures who commit crimes which are unrelated to things like vendettas or logically understandable mechanisms for revenge or whatever. People like serial killers, for example, which have always been popular. I mean, let's face it, as an interest thing. But people like serial killers who commit extravagant crimes against people who they have no actual connection with. It's almost completely random. There is I think apart from the kind of the human interest in gore, which has gone back since forever. I mean, public
yeah.
executions and that kind of thing. But I think there is also this kind of dark fantasy, and I'm not talking about all this dark triad stuff, which is just crap, I think, really, but this kind of dark fantasy of the searing freedom of being an amoral, not immoral, but amoral being, in which you are completely unbeholden to any social norm or and not even that you just act upon impulse. You're not controlled by impulse, but you're not controlled by anything. You are completely amoral, and you do as you feel to be necessary in order to go about your fulfillment. And I think that there is this fascination, and a completely understandable as well fascination with the idea of being a completely amoral being, because I mean, the idea of absolute freedom is, I think, really actually quite a terrifying one. But it is at times a very sinisterly appealing one.
It might have something to do, like similar to that phenomenon, that if somebody is like standing on the edge of a high cliff and they have this not vertigo but this urge to jump down to commit suicide, and it has a
Yeah.
psychological name. I don't remember it right now, but it's well known that people get this. What if I would jump now to my doom? Some psychologists actually said that it might stem from our ancient history, from the caveman era or something like that, that people might have been in a situation where they would have had only the option to commit relatively painless suicide or burn to death or something. There are many kinds of weird mechanisms which are remnants of an era time which is completely different from the modern times.
There's never really been, and for good reason. I mean, there's never been a time, I don't think, in which there's been total freedom, because you can't have that. Have a
Yeah,
functional, you can't even like a functional family unit. You can't have it. There must be some level of
rules.
social of agreed boundaries for interaction and for protection and everything else. The suicidal urge is very interesting, actually. It's very, very curious, and I have no idea really where that desire to simply, and not in a kind of in a genuinely suicidal way, but that the curiosity aspect of what would happen. I don't understand where that comes from. I mean, I think everyone has felt it in some way, like if they're at the top of a building or something. It's like, quite a long way down. I wonder how long that would take.
Yeah, like morbid
it's
fascination.
it
Yeah.
is. It's that kind of that moment of extreme curiosity, which hopefully people don't take themselves up on. But yeah, it's a very curious thing. Extreme innovation, maybe.
If I backpedal a bit to the what you said about the complexity of this phenomena, and with the complexity, I think you and I mean the how deep this theme really is. Like, for example, in the katabasis, to descend into Hades, it's a perilous journey, but there is something to gain from. I think it's related to initiation in the sense that you must endure and you must do things which are unpleasant in order to initiate yourself, in order to grow.
Well,
And
I mean, it comes down to that. I don't think of nothing easy is necessary. Things which are easy aren't necessarily worthwhile. And that's not to say that all suffering is worthy. I mean,
yes,
that's definitely not the case. But but there can be meaning in hardship, particularly if you are choosing the hardship.
so to
Yeah,
speak.
if it's a
Yeah,
chosen hardship, not like drug addiction or something like that, but if it's like a chosen hardship for a purpose, then generally speaking, it will provide a much more meaningful experience. Obviously, and people who suffer from no desire of their own, obviously, it's not a meaningful experience under Pol Pot. So,
this concept with the Freemasons, it's called the vitriol. It's an acronym.
hmm.
Have you heard about that?
Yeah,
Yeah,
I've heard.
it's. I think it's Latin, and in English translation, visit the interior of the earth and purifying it, you will find the hidden stone. And in the Wikipedia,
Oh
it
wow.
says, this is another way of saying, look within yourself for the truth. And it's related to this chamber of reflection, which had these different themes, where as the initiate of the Freemasons would ponder upon death. This is quite interesting that it has also been with the Freemasons, this kind of katabasis theme.
Well, I
Of
mean,
course.
in most actually, well, I say most. I don't actually know enough about Judaic or Islamic traditions in terms of, well, in general, but also especially in terms of their use of, for example, the subterranean in this particular kind of context. But I mean, obviously, you look at the Christian example. I mean, Christ's harrowing in hell. I mean, that is the quintessential, kind of katabasis and anabasis experience, and it would, the Freemasons are strongly rooted in Christianity.
Yes.
At least majoritively. Of course, they have other elements, from other aspects as well. But it's no surprise that they would have such an emphasis on this kind of harrowing aspect almost for their initiate.
This relates to the liminal, and somebody once said when a young guy is within the rite of initiation, he is directly in the liminal. He is no longer a boy, and he is not yet a man. And I think the rite of passage would be akin to katabasis, don't you think?
Oh, certainly.
Yeah.
It is a transitional
Mm.
zone. In effect, you really have a foot in both worlds, because you're neither the man that you were, nor the man that you could become after the initiation aspect is complete. So you're in a kind of transient liminal state, really, a kind of nomad in a
Yeah.
sense between uninitiated and initiated.
Also kind of like a no man.
Exactly,
No man.
exactly. Precisely.
Yeah.
No boy, but no man.
Yeah. Psychedelic experience. I'm speaking about some kind of harrowing psychedelic or some kind of altered state of mind, trance, maybe even sensory deprivation tank or flotation
Oh, yeah,
tank,
yeah.
called nowadays. I think that's also a katabasis, like a bad trip.
Certainly. So, there's definitely an aspect of this the katabasis, but the descent into oneself, especially within the more heavy duty psychedelic substances. You're not talking about leaving your body necessarily, but you're kind of, everything's collapsing in on itself, and you are pushed out into a different space, but you're not exiting through your body in a sense. You're kind of exiting. You're not leaving your body through the top of your head. You're kind of you're being pushed down into yourself and then exited. So it's very much a kind of quite a literal descent aspect.
It's interesting that you brought up this getting out of your own head, or like exiting your own body or state of mind. I think the original meaning of ecstasis wasn't some kind of hedonistic indulgence on some chocolate or whatever, sex. And I think it was really like a harrowing experience, in the sense that you are pushed out of your mind and the body, and it was a traumatic and ontological shock type of thing. I believe that the things one can achieve with the aid of psychedelics, some of that might also be achieved in a kind of natural means, for example, fasting, trance, or it's just maybe a surefire way to induce altered states of mind with the aid of external chemical agent. But I think the experience itself is already at the core of human consciousness. Different means to the same end.
It's a mechanism. It's a mechanism. But I think certainly the potentiality for a psychedelic experience, to use that phrase, exists within you, with or without external provocation.
If one would think different, non-psychedelic means to achieve this kind of strong katabasis or stark katabasis. I mean, the sense that the experience would be
Yes.
so powerful that you wouldn't be able to deny it. It would be impactful. That's what I mean. You might yourself have said it before, that one would need solitude. That's a one like agent of katabasis, of course, because if you have like company, it's always like almost always like some kind of numbing agent for this. And if you have somebody you can talk to and somebody who can uphold the consensual reality, it takes away from that kind of katabasis experience. And maybe if you would be able to descend like literally to some kind of cave or some kind of underground confined space, it would aid for in the katabasis.
That's it, man. I mean, you know, those sort of liminal places are very much a place outside of time. You know,
Yeah.
and that is, well, that's obviously really an ideal space in which to cultivate a sense of sacrality and, you know, a sense of a space in which you're free to kind of go inside or beyond or whichever. I mean, don't forget that, you know, the idea of the church, of a physical church in Christianity, especially within the Middle Ages, was, you know, theologically speaking, it was a space inside. The inside of the church was a space outside of time. And in fact, to go down an archaeological road in Britain, well, in England, there is a theory that a lot of the, whilst a lot in the Anglo-Saxon period, a lot of timber was used, almost exclusively actually timber was used in construction, but churches were generally built out of stone. And there was the idea of the differentiation. One of the theories is the idea of this differentiation between the stone of the church having this eternal, you know, kind of time capsule element, compared to the temporal nature of other buildings, which are mainly timber based. So, you know, it's the idea of a space outside of time, which is very important in these matters, I think.
That's the like a definition of sacred, that it's outside of time, and it has this ecstatic element in the
Yeah,
sense that it removes you from the common time, the chronos,
absolutely,
and you enter the
absolutely.
kairos time, the sacred time, which
Yeah,
Nietzsche Eliade spoke about.
precisely, precisely, precisely.
Now that you mentioned the church, I just heard about the etymology of the word temple. Are
Hmm.
you Do you
No,
know
tell me,
about
tell
this?
me. Tell me.
I try to paraphrase what I learned yesterday, that nowadays people associate the word temple as the literal temple, like
Hmm.
church or some kind of structure, the
Yeah.
house of worship. And I think in the originally templum, the root word for the temple apparently meant kind of like a sacred ground, sacred territory or area in which the temple, the structure was only like a facade at the back of the actual holy symbol or the like symbol of worship, whatever altar or whatnot. And
Oh, okay.
nowadays people associate the facade for the actual thing.
But it's
This
that.
is very
No,
fascinating.
that's interesting. I didn't realize that.
This was really fascinating that a side was sacred and not the visible part
Hmm.
of the thing. And I think I liken that to a mycelium and the mushroom. And mushroom is a kind of a thing which comes and goes. And it's also the conclusive organ of the mycelium, which is the majority of the mushroom. And the people associate that the mushroom is the whole thing and they forget about the mycelium. It's quite interesting that it's very telling of the modern age that people think that the facade is the real thing,
Well, then
but not the actual
what
real thing beneath.
better metaphor could there be for the more for the current attitudes towards so many things?
It's superficial, easily
Exactly,
digested.
exactly.
And I think this is a good way to conclude this dive into the katabasis, in the sense, if something is worth anything, it requires some like an effort. And if you embark on the katabasis, and if you really put in the effort, you might find the philosopher's stones. And
Yes. Well,
the katabasis, the journey is the purifying, in order to see more clearly, in order to find the hidden stone.
But it's yeah, exactly. It comes down to the old thing of if a job is worth doing, it's worth doing properly.
Yes,
Nothing valuable or very little of value comes from an easy, quick process.
this modern way of half-assedness, so to
Well,
speak.
if you want to lose your soul to you know social media, etc., then fine. But I'm afraid you won't be finding any meaningful encounter. You find very few meaningful encounters in such a realm.
That's sad but true.
Apart from obviously anyone listening to this, it goes without saying.
Would you have some like a personal hints or some kind of advice that how would a modern, to summarize this thing up, how would a modern person go about to have this katabasis experience in your own insight? How would you advise?
I suppose effectively it will be don't a few things such as don't feel the need to express your opinion all the time to everybody you meet. Silence is definitely a virtue in many cases, and just try to really think about things and think about yourself, but not in the sense of self obsession, but just take your time to think about things quietly, because that is the stepping stone to all sorts of encounters, especially with yourself, and especially with going, within or going, descending to whatever or anything like that. But silence, thought, yeah, that's probably the best place to start. I would say it sounds very kind of banal and simple, but it's something which I find is very under represented in many aspects of advice or showmanship that occurs. There's a lot of talk about
Yes,
consider this grand approach or this kind of hyper specialized practice. So if you look across the board at most established spiritual practices, and also I mean and psychological aspects as well.
you have mentioned this German philosopher, I think Ludwig Klages, at least a
Mm,
few times before, and think he has been a huge influence for you. And I
I
have,
do like him.
yeah, I have met his name like in some interesting occurrences. So could you give us like a brief introduction? Who was this person?
Oh my god. But firstly, I should say that I'm not literate in German, so I've only read translations.
Yeah.
Um, Someone who people should go if they want to learn about Ludwig Klages, they should go to Paul Bishop, who, as far as I know, is the only really real authority in the English-speaking world on him in a real scholarly sense. So, if you want to know about Ludwig Klages, look at the work done by Paul Bishop. He has several publications, including, I think, definitely a full translation of Cosmogonic Eros, which is on Theon Publishing, and some other books as well, which touch upon Klages. But Klages was in the he was a lot of things. He's a real polymath. Um, One of the things he's most famous for is probably his work in graphology, which is the study of handwriting. But his main kind of like identity now to us is as a fairly radical philosopher and thinker. When I say radical, I don't mean politically. It's very much outside of that realm, which I think is one of the things that makes him so interesting. But he was running around with at some point he was running around with people like Stefan Jorg, Alfred Schuller, Karl Wolfenskell, which was like almost like I guess you'd say like an artistic or poetic circle as well in the early 20th century. But his ideas, as they grew, revolved around exploring a few different things, one of which is his infamous kind of divide between the spirit and the soul. And by spirit, I don't think he meant like the spirit as we understand it. He meant it more as the intellect,
Yes.
and how the intellect kind of cleaves in and destroys the soul in this tension between the two, kind of, in the sense, like the kind of logical and the instinctive, and this tension between the two. The other aspect he had idea was the idea of the God, what's it called? Like the eros of distance, which is, in a sense, this appreciation for things on a very holistic sense. And that sounds such a vague and stupid thing to say, but his example actually is a very nice one, which is like if you're looking at a woodland, say at dusk, and you come away, your memory, well, firstly, the woodland, if you look at a woodland, I mean, you can look at it from several different standpoints, out of a botanist, out of a lumberjack, how much economic value, out of a painter, out of, all sorts of different perspectives on what value that has. But the true value of the woodland is an encompassment of all of those things, plus your own memorial experience which you take away. So it's this very sort of holistic, complex interplay of all these different factors which give value, which is beyond that of the immediate ascribed value to something. He's done, he really, I mean, touched on a huge amount of things, including this idea of getting back to the early, I can't remember what they're called. It was like the pre-Greeks in a sense. He was very, in terms of their appreciation for instinct and for the kind of non-material in a way of looking at things. The Peliphilagians, I think they called something. But really, if you want to know about Paul Klages, Paul Bishop has done a very, very good podcast, which is only about an hour. It's on, I think it's hermeneutics. And he explains very, very well, a million times better than I could ever hope to, on the philosophies and the influences and the drives of Klages. And I really think, when I say radical, I mean radical in the sense of beyond the kind of, well, prosaic political machinations of the time and even of now. And his way, he did a book called The Vitalist Toolkit about Klages. Paul Bishop wrote a book called The Vitalist Toolkit as well, which takes all sorts of elements of his philosophy and unpacks them. That's very much worth looking at as well. But it's a vitalist philosophy in the sense that it's about life as a whole, your holistic experience of life beyond, and it also ties into the Numinous massively in this sort of like otherness, which is very much a part of us as well. So, it's really worth looking into, is what I would say. Really worth looking into.
Lastly, didn't he have a concept called night consciousness?
Yes. Actually, it was you who pointed this out to me.
There is another author on theon publishing called Richard Gavin, and he has this book, The Benighted Path. It's more like a manifesto, and another more recent book out. And it might have been Richard Gavin himself who pointed out this night consciousness by the Klages. And then I understood that I have heard this character from you, and I made the connection. But we will.
I honestly, I don't know much about the night consciousness aspect. But the thing about Klages is that you have to remember, I mean, especially like with other thinkers and people at that time, the sheer volume of output on all sorts of different topics and with a depth of knowledge on each one that puts a lot of us to shame. You could easily spend a lifetime studying his stuff without encompassing all of it, because you're talking about a sheer volume of material he produced. covering a range of different topics. So yeah, if you can read German, I mean, apparently, so I've been told, the Klages stuff is quite difficult because he uses a
To
huge
translate.
amount of,
Yeah.
I mean, not just translate, but even to understand it for Germans, apparently it's really difficult because it's very dense and the language used, it has different connotations, different contextualizations, and a lot of referential material, which he assumes the reader is immediately as familiar with as he himself is. But it's, if you can read German, give it a crack, I say. And if not, then pick up, there's the Theon Publishing translation of Cosmogenic Eros. They also did another volume, which I have, called Chthonic Gnosis, I think, which has, I think, a large, long monograph translated. And Paul Bishop's book on him, Vitalist Toolkit, is worth looking at as well.
What are your thoughts on transcendence, non-being, and death?
As an afterlife issue, or
what would you think is the value of death as the ultimate transcendence for Western people? This is also something our modern Western civilized society tends to shun, that the old people die in the old people's homes and hospitals. That is, when you compare to the cremating grounds in India, for example, we are living in a wholly different kind of society.
Well, even if you go back, a couple hundred years, I mean, things like public executions and whatever, or wakes, more
skeletons
recently.
and
I think having it sounds so, I guess, puerile, but having an appreciation of death, I think really can only have a magnifying effect on your own life, because you're aware. It's not forever. In a more metaphysical sense, I mean, it would be nice, obviously, if if there wasn't a purely corporeal shutdown and that was that. I would be surprised, or maybe not, because I'll be dead, but I would be surprised if there wasn't some aspect of consciousness furthering afterwards in some way. But to be honest with you, I mean, you're gonna die, man. You're gonna find out. So the only thing you can really do in between is to be as decent as you can and try and leave something beautiful in the world. As a legacy, really. There's a lot of talk about legacy in terms of what I leave for building and whatever, but beauty is forever. And if you can make something beautiful whilst you're here, I mean, you could do a lot worse.
How would you distill your gnosis?
The only way I can do it is by giving it some kind of like unrequested advice, which is try to listen to yourself and to other things more. Don't be afraid of silence.
Thank you, and have a good night.
Thank you, Konstantin. It's been my pleasure.
Yeah.